In this video, I'm going to continue my scrap wood projects and I'm going to show you how I made a plaid patterned end grain cutting board. I'm making this cutting board as part of a collection that I'm going to display together. So I'm aiming for cohesion. Every board is going to have a different fabric pattern, but they're all going to be very common patterns that we recognize. I'm going to make them all square and I wanted them to all be 2 inches thick. As you'll see, things didn't quite go according to my plan. This board starts out as a gingham cutting board. So if you want a full breakdown on how to make that, you can check out my other video. But the quick recap is that I grabbed 3 shades of wood, cherry, sapele, and walnut, and alternated the cherry and sapele to make one panel, and I alternated the walnut and sapele to make the other panel. I flattened those panels and then I cross-cut them into strips to glue them up, keeping everything lined up so that the squares form that gingham look. Cross-cutting your panels into these strips is where you're going to set the height of your board. And that's where my first mistake in this project happened. For some reason, I botched the math and I did not make the panels long enough to make a 2-inch thick board. And I wasn't even close. I had enough to comfortably cut 1 5/8 inch pieces, but that's before flattening and finish sanding. So it's going to be even thinner than that. So now that I have a gingham blank to start with, I flattened it using my drum sander. And to do this, I hot glued it to a flat reference board with some shims so that it wouldn't rock and transfer the wobbles to the top. Once one side was flat, I removed the sled and then I flattened the other side. The part that will transform this gingham board into plaid is by adding thin stripes running throughout the board, perpendicular to each other. I went with the 2-color option, and so the light cherry strips are going to run through the dark rows, the walnut rows, and then the dark walnut strips are going to run through the cherry rows. So to keep the board square, these strips need to match my table saw blade thickness, which is about 1/8 of an inch. The grain direction on these strips also needs to match the rest of the board. As I stated in my other video, one of my main goals in making these cutting boards was to use up my shop scraps. So I grabbed all of the thin offcuts laying around, like the ones that are too good to throw away but not really useful for anything. And I glued up 18-inch wide but only 1/8 inch thick panels. Clamping these panels was really difficult, but I just laid my cawls on the top of the panel to weigh it down and make sure that I didn't over tighten the clamp, which would have caused these panels to bow really badly. Then I used my drum sander again to flatten the panels. And while the drum sander is a really good tool for flattening thinner, delicate pieces, it is very slow. So this did take a really long time. Once the panels were flat, I take them back over to my table saw and use my crosscut sled to straighten up one edge. And then I proceeded to cut the strips that are gonna be our stripes in the board. But here's where I made another mistake. I cut the strips oversized. And for some reason, I thought having this extra wood would make sure I didn't have to remove any extra thickness from this board because it was already undersized. But you'll see how that didn't really work out during the glue up and actually forced me to take more material off than I otherwise would have. But at this point, I needed to lay out the cut lines for my walnut stripes. And I was gonna split the light rows down the middle. And when I'm trying to find center of something like this, I usually measure the center from both sides just to be sure that I get dead on center. I drew those lines and then I used a square to carry the lines over the edge. I headed over to the table saw to start slicing this board apart. I made sure to center the blade on each mark as best I could. And sometimes this required me nudging the fence a few times. But there was only 8 or 9 cuts each side, so it really didn't take too long. The last cut on each side of the board left a very thin sliver between the blade and the fence, but I have a gripper push block and it works really well to keep the cut steady and safe. So here's me realizing that I messed up on the sizing of the board. And I've come across my first mistake so far. I cannot tell now if this cutting board was square when I started, but it is certain, regardless, I didn't measure these correctly and they're too short. So now I'm trying to figure out what to do about it. And my thoughts were like, this last one is cut in half and there's a line through it. So I thought of maybe centering these and then cutting, the blocks here in half at the end. And so then it kind of might look more uniform. But over here, there will be no line through this. So maybe it won't look uniform. And then I thought, okay, so maybe actually what I need to do is terminate the cutting board on the maple strip and then cut this strip off and terminate it also on a maple strip on this side. And then if I do that, then I would need to go from dark to dark, like walnut to walnut on this side, which means I should not center this, and I should actually push it all the way to the end here and cut off that maple thing. But I'm really bad. I think this is called like spatial mechanics or whatever, but like imagining what things are going to look like when you've shifted everything around. I'm not good at it, and so I'm not really sure what's going to happen. But I think right now I'm leaning toward gluing them flush down here with the dark strip and probably cutting off the dark strip on this side and the maple strip on that side. Wait. Yeah, that. And now here I am making even more mistakes on my third glue up. Just for reference, I went through an entire bottle of Titebond 3 making this cutting board. Titebond 3 is what I would recommend to use on any cutting board, but whatever glue you pick, you just need to make sure that it is waterproof. If you watch closely, you can see as I tighten the clamps, the problem with those oversized walnut strips. Because they were protruding from the main board pieces, I couldn't really use cawls to hold everything into line. And that meant that those shorter strips shifted vertically between the walnut strips, and it ended up very uneven. I ended up having to remove way more material than I had planned, which took an eternity at the drum sander. The glue up also left the edges of the board uneven, so I didn't have a great edge to run against the table saw fence to clean up all the glue squeeze out. So to clean up the edges, I used a piece of double-sided tape to attach a straight board to the workpiece to use as a guide to run against my fence. Once I got a good clean edge, I just removed the temporary guide, flipped the board over, and cleaned up the other side. I made sure to remove as little material as possible here. So now we're just going to repeat that whole process, but rotated 90 degrees and for the opposite colors. So I mark out my lines on the walnut rows where the light cherry stripes are going to run perpendicular to the walnut stripes. After the walnut stripe fiasco, I made sure to trim the cherry strips to the same height and length as the rest of the board so that I could caul everything. Then I cut the board apart in the same way as before, centering the saw blade on my cut lines. For the fourth glue up, I was also sure to work at about only 3 strips at a time so that the glue stayed workable and I was able to use cawls to keep everything flat. This glue up went much, much better than the third one. At this point, I think both me and my drum sander were worn out. The belt had worn down significantly, and during this round of flattening, I got some really bad burn marks on the board. But I persisted, and so I took it back to the table saw to clean up the edges again. Using that double-sided tape straight edge trick, thing. Here is where I ended up having to cut off an entire row to make up for that miscalculation with the walnut strips. I had to get rid of that maple row that didn't have a full walnut strip in it, and so to keep the board square, I ended up having to cut off one of the dark rows on the other side. And it's at this point that I realized I could have saved the height of the board by doing this at the beginning, but you live and you learn, and there's really nothing I could do about it at this point. So I just kept on moving, which means we're to juice groove time. And so I put a juice groove on this board using the same method I did on my gingham board. I used the juice groove jig that I made based on 3x3 Customs design. This is an adjustable jig that acts as a fence for your router. And the bottom of the fence has an offset based on the size of your router base, so you get the perfect juice groove layout no matter the size of your board. I cut the groove using multiple passes with the router to try and avoid any burning that I would have to sand out by hand. After the juice groove, I cut the finger grooves in the exact same way as I did on my gingham board. Again, I'm trying to maintain consistency across the collection. So I just clamped offcuts to the edges of the board to act as a stop for my router. This board is larger than the gingham one though, and so I used the longer side of my router base to make sure that the finger groove was still a pretty normal size. Again, I recommend taking many shallow passes as opposed to trying to hog it all out at once. Then I profiled the board using a smaller roundover than before. And I did that because this board ended up being thinner than I had planned, and I didn't want such a heavy roundover on it. So instead of the 1/4 inch roundover, I went with the 1/8 inch roundover. Because of all the burn marks on this board, it took a lot of sanding. When you start woodworking, your first instinct when sanding might be to hit your problem areas with the sander until it disappears. But if you do that, what you're actually going to do is create divots in your formerly flat workpiece. So when sanding, it's important that you work the entire surface down evenly until all of the imperfections are gone. And this does just take time. So the best advice that I can give on sanding is to invest in good sandpaper, invest in good dust extraction, and invest in hearing protection with Bluetooth. I was asked on my last video if I water pop my cutting boards. And the honest answer is it depends. And it depends on a lot of factors. But broadly speaking, I do water pop my face and edge grain cutting boards, but I don't on my end grain cutting boards. For those of you who don't know, water popping is where you lightly wet the surface of the board before you do your last round of sanding. And this causes the wood's grain to absorb a little bit of the moisture, making it stand up off the surface of the board where you can sand it down smooth again. And the whole point in doing this is to prevent that fuzzy feeling the first time someone uses their cutting board. But that really only applies to face grain cutting boards. Because of the orientation of the grain on end grain cutting boards, all of that face grain is glued together instead of exposed. So water doesn't really have this effect on end grain cutting boards. So that's why I don't do it. It wouldn't hurt anything to do it, but I just think it's kind of pointless. And so now we're on to the best part, which is putting the oil on, because it's always such a transformation. But because this board ended up thinner than I wanted, I decided to put some feet on it. The normal clear rubber feet that I used just didn't feel up to the task on this board. It felt too fancy for that. And so I ordered some of these brass cutting board feet, and they do look really beautiful, but they are also crazy expensive compared to normal cutting board feet. To install them, I just evenly measured 1-inch offsets off of each corner of the board. I pre-drilled the holes, and then once the oil was dried, I screwed them in. And a tip when you are putting on cutting board feet, be sure to turn the torque of your drill down. Otherwise, you can over tighten the screw and strip out either the hole or the head of the screw. So here it is, an imperfect plaid cutting board, but I actually think it still ended up really, really beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed watching.